Hello everyone and welcome to video lecture 10, your final video lecture for the CM Construction Management stream. It is part 2 in Enscape. In this video we are going to be looking at lighting, not only lighting from the sun but also artificial lighting in the interiors, as well as setting up your Skydomes for your background, adding extra bits of information into your model and into your perspectives to make them really sing, as well as all of the different settings you can edit inside Enscape when composing your final perspectives to make really truly impressive client renders. Plenty of stuff for you to learn in this final chapter for you to really turn your perspectives up a notch and produce some pretty impressive stuff. Let's get stuck in. All right, so now that we've got our materials working well, we've got our landscape, our assets all working well, we're now going to move on to lighting. So lighting is very much going to change everything else that we've done, which is why we had to get all the other stuff done first, because the lighting is not only going to change the contrast, the brightness, all that sort of thing, it's also going to change the color of everything that's in our scene. So we kind of need all of those things in place so that we can test what it's going to look like once we change the lighting conditions. Now, the first thing we need to think about is we've got two different types of lighting. We've got exterior lighting and interior lighting. First one we want to do is an exterior lighting shot. Exterior lighting is very much going to be dependent on what's going on with our sun. When we get to interior in a second, we'll look at adding some artificial lighting. But for now, let's have a look at how we can play around with the sun in order to optimize our lighting. So the sun, very easy to deal with. What we're going to do is go up into View Management, and then we're going to go into Create View so that we can start to play around with the sun. Now, of course, if I put this back up here for you again, we can also play with the sun's position, the time of year, where it is located inside Sketchup, but it's a little bit easier to do inside Enscape, and you can see it in real time while you're playing around with that. So I prefer to do this in Enscape. Easiest thing, just to create a new scene. You can jump back to the previous scene that you liked and then just create a new view so that it sits in the same place if you want to. Create view, I'm going to call this one Exterior 1. And then from there, what we can do is we can change the sun's position in the sky. So of course we have our north, south, east, west. We can change where the sun is sitting. So at the moment we're coming from this direction over here. We can change it so that the sun is actually coming through the trees and from behind the house. So it's going to obviously change the color, temperature of the lighting. Remember we talked about before. We can change it so that it's sitting just off to the side, or ideally, probably what we're going to do is change it so that the house, the main features, our USP, are going to be in direct lighting from the sun. So I like something kind of like this, so I can highlight those arches, because remember that's part of our USP, and that also kind of shows off this curve quite nicely as well at that point. Maybe our shadows are too long, however, so what we might want to do is play with the height of the sun in the sky. So if we come too far back, it's going to get overcast. We're going to go through where a cloud is, and we can just kind of massage it until we get it to where we want it to be. So the lower we go, the closer we're going to get to what effectively feels like sunset. We get into sunset, we get into what's called the golden hour. The golden hour just means just before the sun is going to dip below the horizon, we get this beautiful golden hue to everything. Golden hour shots typically do look a little bit better, but it depends on what kind of mood you're going for. Just after sunset, we've got this kind of low setting sun sky, and that's reflected in the window up there. That's pretty nice as well. So again, it's really dependent on what you're looking for in terms of your shot. And we've got some nighttime shots here as well, but no artificial lighting. So we need to come back into the sun. Now I'm happy playing with something maybe around a little bit of golden hour and maybe a little bit moved over. Yeah, that's looking pretty interesting. So that can be one. Create. And then we can jump back into exterior 1 and we'll see that changes it up from what we had before. If we go back into a previous version of the camera, we can jump over to here as well. And that's a different lighting condition as well. So really what we can do is we can create a whole bunch of different views. And we can make them at different times of day for each view so that we can track and measure whether or not we like it. So for example, I've clicked on exterior 1. I can create another view, call it exterior 2. And then again, I can go ahead and change this sun position. So if I want to go up a little higher this time, I want to pull around to this way over here now. This time I want to show off these columns along here. We've got that nice arch still coming through. We've got that sweeping curve is now being highlighted by the sun. And we can see we've got our asset person sitting in there, sitting at their breakfast table with that light coming in behind them as well. So that's another nice shot there too. We're still showing off our USP, our key features, but in a different type of lighting. If I click create, now I can toggle between the two. So I can say exterior 1, that's got nice edges here, but we've got a little bit too much sun coming in from there. This is probably the better shot out of the two. And then of course I can come back to these other ones. If I was liking these before, just rename this one, exterior 3, create, and I've got that one there as well. So if I decided actually the original lighting that I had before was a good balance between the two, I can jump back to that one as well. That really is how we do play with our exterior lighting. Let's have a look at an interior scene. Okay, so we've come to do an interior shot now. And the first thing we'll notice is that I've got some different lighting going on in here. So what we need to do is you'll by default have auto exposure turned on. And so that means no matter where we go, whether we're out here, we've got bright sun versus artificial light in here, it's automatically always adjusting the light for us. What that tends to do is washes the images out a bit and it makes it a little bit unrealistic. If we were to stand inside here with that much brightness of sun, this would be comparatively much darker. So we need to make sure we turn that auto exposure off so we can start adjusting things ourselves. Now this position that we're in here, it's actually pretty close to where auto exposure was. It wasn't too much adjusting that we need to do, but we can still adjust a little bit more when we come down to the manual exposure underneath. So if we bring this down a little bit, we can see now that the brightness of the sun outside is doing most of the work. We've got some artificial lighting that I've put in here and we'll go through in a second, but we don't have quite enough light going on to see what's going on there, and boosting up the artificial lighting isn't really going to do that for us. If we go too far the other way, we can see we're burning out too much of that light there. So we've got to bring it into about 55% will be fine. And then what we've got here is some artificial lighting to pick the difference. So I've created a series of lights here and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. And then what we can do is we can play with how much lighting is coming through here as well. So typically what I like to do before I start putting in my artificial lights is actually just kind of adjust what's going on with the sun and with the ambient brightness inside. So the sun I've brought up a little bit. You can see here it's got the return feature, so it says this is what it was by default before. It was on 80%, and artificial brightness I've left as is, and my ambient I can return back to what it was, 50, fine. So 100 for sun just brings that little bit more pop. We'll see what happens. I can turn this up and it's just going to bring more and more light inside the house, but again we're burning out too much there, so I think 100 is about right. Subtlety is key here, and the ambient brightness we can change, and that will have varying effect depending on where you're positioning your camera relative to looking outside versus inside shot. We've got a bit of a mix of both. So editing the sun brightness. So I've got a pretty good general level now, so that when we start putting in our artificial lights, we don't have to do too much adjusting afterwards. Whereas if we don't do these initial adjustments first, you'll find that there's a lot of back and forth between your artificial and your sun lighting. So you get it to roughly where you want it to be, and then we can start adding in a bit more artificial light so that we don't have so much shadow going around for our interior shot. Right, so with our artificial lights, we'll notice here in my SketchUp model, I've got two different things going on. I've got both the actual light fitting, and then I've got the spotlight that is coming down from the light fitting via Enscape. So we need to do this in two parts. So if back in SketchUp we were bringing in a light, which comes in from the Enscape Objects tab, we notice that we've got sphere, spotlight, a line light, a rectilinear light, and a disc light. At the moment, we've got these spotlights we're going to bring in, so we can see spotlight is probably most appropriate for what we're doing. We choose the location and we choose the direction that it's going in. If I just move this out of the way, let's do it down towards the sink there, and perfect. Once we've got that open, we've then got a bit more adjustment to play with, and we can see it's added a bit more light there. If I turn this up, we'll see that it's throwing more light. I will leave this up to an obnoxious level just so we can see what we're doing. Let's put that all the way up. If I change the beam angle, that's going to change that into more of a spotlight. or if I make it wider, it's going to fill out the room a little bit more. What we've got to be careful of is just having too much light hitting walls, hitting surfaces, creating shadows, and looking a little bit fake. So we need to be careful that the type of light fitting that we're using and the type of, whether it's a spotlight, a sphere light, line light, actually matches what that would do in reality. So that is how we can set up our spotlight. It's pretty straightforward. The one thing to remember is when we're doing our spotlight, we do it below where we've put our object in for the actual light itself. Otherwise, we'll start to illuminate the light and it won't look very realistic. The other thing we need to do is import assets for lighting. The reason why we need to do this is because we need to change the material inside the light fitting, and we can't do that at the moment with an Enscape asset. So at the time of recording this video, Enscape doesn't allow you to change the materials of the assets. So we need to get our assets from somewhere else. How we do that is a place called 3D Warehouse. So if we jump over here, 3dwarehouse.sketchup.com, this is all of the SketchUp products. They're all free. They come with your free education license that you've got with your SketchUp installation. All you need to do is come into 3D Warehouse and type in light. If you go to Google, type in SketchUp Warehouse, it'll bring this up for you. Type in light. That is the spotlight that we've downloaded. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and download another one and we'll install it together. So I've got this little Arandela simpler light that I'm going to install right now. Okay, so that is loaded up at the moment. Now we go back into SketchUp. What we're going to do is bring that in, and I'll show you what I mean by changing the material in just a second once we import that. So let's go ahead first and bring that light in. So File, Import, and then there it is. That's the one we just downloaded, SKP. Make sure when you're looking for what you've downloaded, you change to the correct file type. Click that one, click Import. And sometimes it's offset from your mouse. You might just need to move it away from where you want it to be. So I'm clicking over here, even though it's in the middle of the space. That's fine. Other times you might find it sitting all the way at your XYZ coordinates out in space over there. So you might just have to dig around a little bit to find it. Okay, we're just going to rotate this one first. And then I'm just going to go ahead and put it back to the wall over here. And we can see in our Enscape model in real time where that's sitting. I reckon a little bit lower actually. Let's pretend this is a reading nook and someone's going to sit down here and read a book. And so we can have this light a little bit lower. It won't matter if, yeah, I'm happy with that. Okay, so that's the first step, is bringing the asset in. The next step is to change the material of this light so that we actually start throwing some light out into the space. So first things first is I'm going to hit B for brush and Alt in order to grab that material. Give that a second to load. It might take a little bit of time depending on how big the asset is. Let's open up our material editor. Should have that glass bulb in because we've just done Alt. Again, if that didn't work for you the first time, you can go back into SketchUp, hold down Alt, and that should definitely bring it up for you, glass bulb. Then what we want to do is change it. Instead of being generic so that it shows a glass material, what we want to do is go down to self-illuminated. Once we've done that and we turn this luminance up, we'll see that it is starting to throw some light out of there. Beautiful. So if we were to go over to here now, we'll see that object is now actually throwing some light. It's casting light into the space. Not so much that it's actually generating light here. We don't need to worry about that yet. We just want to make sure that the light looks like it's on, which it does there. We can see light coming off of that. Same thing with these lights that I put up here, the spotlights. I changed the material inside these ones here so they actually look like they're illuminating something. Then the last step we do for our light is to actually put a light inside that spot. So we're going to go up into plus Enscape objects. Bring that over to here. Let's get a spotlight. We're going to pull that down and let's just change our view so we can see where we are. Let's put that on the globe. Happy with that. And then I'm just going to direct it down here at the chair. Pull that out of the way for a second. Trying to line it up with the alignment of this guy here so it's a little bit off center. Yeah. Happy with that. Double click. Cool, and then we just want to check that we're in the right position. Not quite. So we can pull this back out a little bit, move that one over into there. Perfect. So that is now in this spotlight position. The next thing we're going to do is just change that light setting. Okay, so again, we can turn this up. And as we turn that up, we're going to get more of a spotlight on that bench there. We can play with the angle. So if we want that to come all the way up to the top of the wall, but bring that down a bit, we can do that. Or if we want to bring it in, make it feel more like a spotlight and turn that up a bit, we can do that too. Really, ultimately, it comes down to what the experience you're trying to achieve for the end viewer is there. If you put a person sitting in there reading a book, that's going to give them a certain experience. So I want to tone it down a little bit. We don't want to go too heavy. None of our other lights are too heavy either, so I'm pretty happy with that. So that's the process for adding your lighting. We go to Sketchup Warehouse. We find something that works for us. We'll notice that a lot of these lights look a whole lot like the lights that are trending at the moment, and that is because companies pay a lot of money to have their products put on here so that architects, builders, consultants will specify their lighting, right? So these are very, very high quality models ready for you to bring in. Once you've brought it in, by importing it, you then change the material of either the outside face, the inside face, or the glass itself to be self-illuminating, and then you put a light in there. In this case, it's a spotlight. We have, of course, the sphere, the rectangle, and the line light. Line light, pretty straightforward. If we're doing something here like a splashback, you really effectively, we're just putting a line of light in by drawing it in. They only go to 3 meters long, so you need to do multiple of them if your space is more than 3 meters. So let's go ahead and just fill in that last little gap that we've got there. So let's jump over to that area in SketchUp. And I can see there's a little bit of gap, not quite finished there to there. Let's stretch it out a little bit. And then we just need to move it around and adjust the settings so that it matches with the rest of the light. And that is just a matter of rotating it through and adjusting its position in space so that it lines up with where this guy is here. We have, of course, the sphere light, which throws light in all directions. The rectangular light, which we can add something big here, a rectangle, to throw more light into this space and have more sunlight coming in from that particular direction, or disc lighting as well. Plenty of artificial lighting there to play with. The challenge is making sure that it feels realistic and feels like the lighting actually matches what we see in the space there. Once we've got enough lights inside the scene and we feel like it's heading in the right direction, we can of course come back to our visual settings, this one up here, and we can play with, in the atmosphere tab, the artificial brightness here. So rather than turning every individual light up and down, we can grab all of the lights at the same time. So say, for example, we changed to more of a nighttime scene and then we needed to bring the artificial lighting down because it was too bright, or if we have brighter sunlight and we need to throw a bit more light around to balance against that, we can do all of this inside here. So very, very useful setting inside the visual settings there, atmosphere. Now that we've set up our exterior lighting and our interior lighting, another thing we want to think about is what is called the Skydome or the skybox. And that is everything that we see up here. So this is a generic sky that's created by Enscape for you. We can also get much higher resolution skies, and we can change what happens in the background here so that we don't see this nasty black horizon line. Of course, we can use vegetation to try and hide that. So like we did over here in this shot, we position ourselves just lower than this garden line, and then we're not going to see any of that. And this still feels pretty good, like we're in the right position. But if we happen to be facing this way and we're standing inside an interior shot and we wanted to look over the kitchen bench out like that, we need to get rid of that. So the reason why we talk about this in the lighting section is because the background is going to change what happens in your interior and exterior lighting. Let's have a look at some skyboxes. So on the website Polyhaven, they have a whole host of free HDRI skies for you. And what we see here is not only the sky, but also the ground and the stuff that's going to be around the model at the horizon line as well to help break it up for you. What you want to look out for when you're choosing an HDRI skybox or a skydome is the qualities of these spheres. So we can see what are the caustics and reflections on glass going to look like, how bright is it against the white, how much are my colors popping, and what are my reflections looking like. Okay, so we can see on some of these the white sphere is brighter, some of it's duller, sometimes it's got more of a bluey, purpley color to it, sometimes it's dark. So we can scan through all of these. What I'm looking for is an outdoor. Let's choose something that is pretty straightforward. This one is just a green field. So I'll download that. And let's get another one. Now into our visual settings tab, and we're going to go over to sky. And the default is clear as our source. Let's change that over to skybox. And then at the moment, yours will look something like this. Need to load skybox from file, and let's go ahead and add one of these, and we'll see that change. You'll notice that not only is it changing what we see out the window, which is great. We've now got a view outside the window. It's also changing the lighting condition as well. So because this is an overcast sky, we're getting a more muted tone to our building that we have there. So keep in mind that the type of skybox you're using will change the lighting. Again, this is why we're talking about this at the lighting phase, because it's going to change what we see from that point there. So the beauty of this is we now also have a view out the line as well. Now this is a bit weird, the fact that it just stops to nowhere, but at least there is something going at that point. We would be clever and make maybe a low wall over here, or maybe break it up a bit and put a gate in there and we see something through the gate. We don't just have to leave that open-ended. We can be clever about how we provide continuity there. When we go out, this is when we end up a little bit more trouble, because that is quite an obvious difference between the two. There's a couple of things we can do. We can try the rotation and see if there's maybe a greener area that matches a little bit better. So we can rotate this around and see if there's something a little bit more suitable. We can also try playing around with the brightness and seeing if we can kind of get a tone that matches what's going on, but that might change your lighting a little bit too much with what's going on there. So you need to keep those things in mind with you playing around. Ultimately, it may just be better to change into a different Skydome. So you want to try a few of them before settling on one to make sure A, it's hitting your USP. So we're still going to see things looking the way we want them to look. The colors are right, the materials are right, all of that stuff we spend all that time on is still looking good as we look at that. So keep those things in mind as well. What we can do also is actually change it so the lighting of the Skydome matches directly with the position of the sun in our model. So if I click on this one here, brightest point is sun direction, that's going to change. Let's make this even more obvious so we can see that that's the brightest point over there. So that's where the sun is inside the Skydome, but that's not necessarily matching where our sun's coming from in the model. So what we can do is click this one here, and then it's in exactly the same position. So we can see that's a very low sun at the moment. And then as we rotate that sun around, it's going to change the position of the shadows, change the position of the lighting there as we do that. So that gives even more realism. But now we can see this Skydome is not really working for us because that's not really the time of day I was looking for. Maybe it'll be okay as like a low evening shot, something coming through there, picking up on those timbers. I'm not sure. But for this exterior one, not quite what I was looking for. So then we just go back into here and we try something else. So let's go ahead, we'll try this one here. It's golf course, give it a second to load. Okay, that's looking pretty interesting, giving us a view as well. We're right on the edge of a pond here, so maybe that's not appropriate or extra appropriate. Who knows? Again, we've got all those things we can play with the rotation. Do we want that brightest point? We could probably still get away with that actually. Depending on where you position your camera, we can get away with not seeing where exactly the sun is coming from, and therefore maybe we don't need it exactly matching up. If however we come over here and we can see the sun's there, but the shadows are coming from that angle, then obviously we know we've got a problem because it should be more like that. So just be careful with your camera position when you're messing around with whether or not the brightest point is aligned. Another one, midday. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. Bit more of a sky there, it's looking pretty cool. And gives us certainly another option to play with as well. And when we're looking at this view, once again, we can rotate this around. That's going to change our time of day. That's going to change what it looks and feels like relative to the sun position. If we're not happy with any of these, of course, we can go back and find something that's more similar to our original sky. So if we go back to clear, we can go back into Skydomes and say, hey, the sun was actually closer to midday, maybe a little bit later in the afternoon, and it was a blue sky. So we can go back into our Polyhaven again, jump back out into here, and then we can say, okay, I'm looking for something that is a nice blue cloudy sky, close to midday with some good shadows. And then you just keep scanning through here. There's hundreds, maybe even thousands in here. So you will find something that's appropriate to you. You just got to keep looking through. That's an option. You can always just use the Enscape sky that you have there. If you feel like this is most appropriate for you and is working really well for you, that's fine. Where it's really not fine is when we've got this ugly horizon line, or if we've got a window that we should be seeing something beyond. You can, of course, mask that out and make some architecture, maybe even download some houses on Sketchfab or something like that. But we need to see something out there. We should not ever be seeing just a naked horizon line there. So that's something that you need to explore and experiment with, making sure that we're filling in those gaps, making sure the sun is appropriate, making sure that it's matching our lighting and what we've been working on in this video. Once we've got our lighting working for both our exterior and interior shot, we've got something in the background, be that landscape or an HDRI, we're really getting close to where we want to be now. At this point, this is when you start to ask yourself and reflect upon what else can I add to this so that it feels more realistic and so that I'm really highlighting the USP. I'm going to go through a couple of things now that I need to add into this shot to make it really, really wow the client and really show off the best parts. So for me, a few things that I've identified looking through here is there's actually glazing in this wall here that I never modeled in SketchUp. There would be some bifold doors here. It's not just going to be open all the time, so that's not very realistic. And if I look at my SketchUp model, there's a bunch of stepping stones in here giving me a cue that I'm kind of missing that at the moment. I know that there's a gate there and we're going to arrive at this part of the house if we have people over. So that's missing as well at the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in each of those elements so that I can add a little bit more flair and a little bit more of those USP moments and key features for the client. Big one for me is this window feature. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hide all this stuff out of the way now just to get it out. Here we go. And remember, if we need to bring that back, we just go up to edit, unhide and all, and that will bring it all back. Okay, so now I can see everything in this arch here. And I'm going to go ahead and fill this back in so that I can make a window out of it. So what I've done here, before you will have noticed that I made that much thinner framing than usual, is I just want this to look like a beading running around the edge rather than a full framing. And so because I've made that black, that gives that a bit of a shadow line, and then I've got the glazing on the inside of that, and it brings a little bit more of the realism into that shot there. And then all we need to do is just copy that into the other spaces. Next one, let's get those pavers in. Beauty, that is our pavers looking good. Little bit of grass coming through. We can raise those and lower those if we're not happy with the fuzziness. I don't mind it. I like it. I think it kind of shows that it's not totally clean and it's not exactly perfect. Happy with that. Then let's go ahead and add in those bifolds now. Okay, material is not quite right. Needs to be more of an ashy color. Maybe a little bit oranger. Yeah, not bad. Yeah. Yeah. Matches quite well. Good. And then, of course, to change the glazing. Cool, and let's group that. Cool, so that is our door. Door, pretty straightforward. We know this is exactly 1/4 of the 4 doors there. So we can just copy 4 of them, easy as. Let's pull this one out to like 85 degrees, not quite at 90. And then, yeah, that's fine. Then what we're gonna do is just make copies of these doors through the rotation. So rather than moving and rotating, we'll just do it in one go. So what I'm going to do is go from this corner here, hit Control, grab from that corner, and then I'm just going to open one door up this way. Cool. And then don't forget, we've got to go back in here and move that out. Now, what I like to do actually is not put them together perfectly, because doors don't go together perfectly. There's going to be a bit of a gap to allow for the hinges. So I like to allow a bit of a shadow line. Now, if we get them to there, then just on the green axis, let's say 10 mil as a shadow line. And we can see just faintly on our Enscape model, there's a line between the two there, which is great. That's what we're looking for, that little bit of extra pizzazz and detail. Next one, let's rotate this one in. Shadow lines, we can see two of those shadow lines coming through there, and that is a good looking set of doors. So if we go over here, we can see once we get a little bit closer, that gives us that nice shadow line as well. Nice little detail. We don't need to see the hinges. We're not getting that much into it. However, that is now really starting to feel a lot more realistic. Just that little gap makes all the detail. One more thing is just a little capping detail at the top of the brickwork up there. That's another easy one I can add, but just adds that little bit more realism to it. So let's go back over into SketchUp. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to grab a copy of this, Control C, get out of the group, Control V. We'll bring that back over to here, just where there's nothing, so I can get to a corner. Corner goes on there, Control G. Then let's just go ahead and maybe, let's try 50 mil. Yeah. It's just enough to have that little bit of capping around the edge, but not so much that it looks like we've put another slab on there or something. Yep, pretty happy with that. So that is the final steps really, in just adding that extra bit of USP and really making it feel like the house is showing off its best attributes. So we've got some little shadow lines here. We've got that glazing now sitting inside the wall. We've got that set of doors sitting there nicely. We've got these stepping stones, we've got that capping. It's all starting to feel a little bit more realistic. All right, now that we've got all of those features in, the USP is looking good and it's feeling the way we want to in terms of the lighting, materials, assets, everything is good. Now we're on to the final steps. So what we want to do is go up to our visual settings and do the last bit of playing around before we go to our export and make the final render. We've got a few things to play with in the main page. Our field of view is a big one. So if we are standing far back but has a close-up view, it's going to create a very different feeling to the image than by actually moving forward. Without getting into the science of it, it will make a big difference for you. You can create some more dynamic, cinematic feeling images by bringing down the field of view and stepping your camera back. So you can really create some quite playful scenes in there as well. So I definitely recommend you experiment with your field of view. We've also got the depth of field as well. So for example, if I start to bring this in, we'll see that what it does is it's creating a blur effect. If I change from autofocus to manual by turning that off, what it allows us to do is set the range of focus, and we'll see as I start to slide this through, we'll get this light line which is telling us where exactly is in focus. If I get just the tip of the building up there, we'll see this is now all in focus, where everything else is starting to blur out a bit. So if I pull out of here, go ahead and turn my cameras off, we'll see that that creates a blur effect for us. So I can pull this out again, there we go. So I see that this front face of the house is in focus, but everything else is blurry. Now, of course, I'm being extreme with how much blur I've put on here, but that's just to allow you to see what's going on. So you can pull it back from there. So adding a little bit of blur, but keeping the focus, helps to give more realism to the image, like you're taking an actual photograph. If I turn this off by bringing depth of field all the way down, you'll see the difference. So everything is in focus. The grass is in focus, the wall is in focus, the background is in focus, the people are in focus, everything's in focus. So adding a little bit of depth of field gives you a little bit more realism in your shots. So it's something that you want to experiment with and play around to see what is the right amount for you. What's the perfect shot to get everything across without having it feeling unrealistic. So that's in all of your main settings. Of course, you got the rendering quality as well. We can, up in our image settings, we can play around with the highlights and the shadows. You'll be familiar with all this sort of stuff, basic photo editing from Instagram, Facebook, all of your social media. What on your smartphone, you've played with it all before. So highlights brings up the whites, shadows brings down the darks. So we can start to play around with that as well. And that's going to make the image have a more dynamic feeling to it, being a bit darker. Saturation, of course, we know what that does. We can play around with that, bring that back up. Color temperature. So if we go higher, it's going to get a bit cooler, a bit more blue. If we go down lower, it's going to get warmer. Okay, so you can play around with what happens in your color temperature there as well. Motion blur, lens flare, bloom. So bloom is effectively like putting Vaseline on the lens. It makes everything a little bit hazy. So if you're looking for that effect of having it all smoky and quite atmospheric and poetic, you can turn up the bloom. Don't go too nuts. Don't go having stuff like this. Not really necessary. So you can pull it up a little bit, but really this is going to be depending on personal taste. Vignette, this allows us to put, you'll see the blackening of the edges coming in around here. Not always necessary. By default, it's got a little bit in there. Chromatic aberration, you can play around with as well. Plenty of things to play with in there. Auto contrast, I don't really like to play with because I like to play with the shadows and the highlights myself, but that is there for you if you do want to play with it. Atmosphere we've looked at a little bit, so we can do things like add fog, which is going to allow us to add some God rays into there. So if I come in through, we'll see that light quality as it starts to come through the trees there. We can play around with that. We can play around with the height of the fog. We can play with the sun brightness. So brighter sun is going to change the different effects that we start to see in there. Nighttime, obviously, if we're taking a nighttime shot. The shadow sharpness, you know what that is. Artificial lights, if we're standing outside but we still want to be able to see the lights are on, we might need to boost them up a little bit so we still see the lights. Ambient brightness, that is going to change your levels of what's going on in terms of the ambient light coming through. Wind, you might want to turn this all the way down, particularly if you're on a slow computer. You don't want this to be moving around too much. This is more for videos, but while you're editing, if you don't want the trees and the pool and the water to be dancing around and the grass as well, turning that all the way down might help you to speed things up a bit as well. We've got our sky settings, which we played around with before with the HDRI skybox, and then if we're doing just a normal Enscape sky, we can play around with the clouds, all that stuff in there. Once we're in a position where we're happy to take our shot, we've got the output section here. So by default, we're on full HD, which means 920 by 1080p. That is perfectly fine for doing all of your tests. The tests, of course, are checking to make sure that we've got everything set up. The big things are the USP. Are we showing the key features of the house in this perspective? The perspective itself. Are we in a nice single vanishing point here where everything's pointing back in one direction? Or if we got it on a really interesting 2-point perspective, how are we showing this? And are we in a position that best celebrates the house, but also feels like we're actually there? So remember, we want to make the client feel like they're actually standing inside this shot, experiencing it firsthand. We can't do that if we're all the way too down low in the grass, or if we're up here in no man's land in a random drone shot perspective. Even slightly too high feels a little bit weird and ruins the shot. So does slightly too low. So it's important that you do some test renders to make sure that it's feeling the way it needs to and getting across those ideas. So these are the kinds of things you would test at 1080p. Then when you're ready, you can bump that up to Ultra HD as the final resolution. Let's leave it at 1080p now and we'll take our first render. What we're going to do is go up to our batch rendering, and we can do all of them if we want to. But for the moment, I'm just going to do exterior 3 and click on render images. It'll ask where we want it. Downloads for me, click save. And then depending on your computer, your graphics card, your processing power, it might take a little while for that to happen. So be patient. Could take 5, 10 minutes, half an hour, depending on your computer speed. Over to your downloads folder. Let's have a look. Great. Okay. So for me, perspective, not quite right. This vertical line isn't vertical. It feels like it's cinching in, like the walls are closing in a little bit. And I might be a little bit too high and a little bit too far over. Great. So that is great reason to take a test render so we can see all those things. What I do like about it is I can see all of these USP moments. I've got those arches, I've got some nice reflections, the sky's looking good, the trees are looking good, got that sweeping arc looking good. Okay, we've just got a few changes to make in terms of that position. Then what we would do is click on that exterior shot, make sure we're there in the exact position so that we can then pull back from there, move around to where we need to. Okay, yeah, I don't want to go too far off. I'm going to be on that edge there. So and we'll hide this just to make sure we're looking at from the same vantage. Bit of finessing, making sure it looks the way we want it to. And then of course, we know what to do here. We can just go ahead and create a new view, exterior 4. Don't need to change any settings because we've already done that. And then let's go ahead and do a render of exterior 4, render images, same folder. Exterior 4, great. And then we can do our comparison. So I can toggle over to exterior 3 and we can see, yeah, we were too close to the tree before. It was closing in a little bit. That's a better shot. There we were before. That's looking better. Maybe a bit too much artificial lighting in that back. So I can pull that back down again. We can maybe play with a little bit more blur as well and maybe bring the bloom up. And that is the process. We just keep testing and making sure we're getting closer and closer to what we're actually looking for in terms of showing the client the best possible imagery there. We of course do this for our exterior shots. We do this for our interior shots as well. And we build up that catalog. We build up that presentation kit to best represent the architecture, best represent the building, the project, the scheme, whatever it is that you're putting forward to the client. All right, everyone, that is the end of video lecture 10. As we said there, you want to continue to test as you go. It's not going to be something that happens perfectly the first time. There's going to be some trial and error, some testing, different lighting, different camera position, different camera settings. Test it all, do lots of variations of your shots, and of course bring them to class for feedback. We will point you in the right direction, even give some suggestions on other things to try as well, so that you can maximize your outputs and really communicate the USP and communicate the strengths of your project. That's all for video 10. Happy rendering.